The main door of that apartment I was in just imploded. It wasn't that the door came loose or opened. It came right off the hinges. That door imploded and came right down, and a big man came through that door carrying a knife. And I could see in that man's face, in his eyes, that man was devoid of an immortal soul. That man was on just a different plane than, it was terrifying just to look at him. I'd never seen him before, never met him. I don't know that I'd ever heard of him at that time. His name was Arthur Lee Allen.
I think it was 1962. Sandy Panzarella and myself and Ron were renting a house together, and Lee paid us a visit one time.
He came down and stayed at our place on a couple of occasions, and I got to know him well enough to know I didn't like him. And I thought he was reckless.
When he came in, he made a big entry with knives and guns and a lot of hoopla.
When he wanted attention, he would go to such extremes, like the story about the bug crawling across the table and him trying to hit it with a machete. It would just startle you. Scare you.
He stuck a big knife into the middle of our kitchen table. He got everybody's attention.
He told me that he got fired from a teaching job because he carried a Magnum under the car seat, under the front seat of his Austin Healey. And later I found out he was really he was fired for child molestation.
He was teaching trampoline to those little girls over there, and I suspected it had to do with them.
He wanted to be a teacher. He liked a children's world. He liked kids. He liked to be a part of that world. To what extent, I didn't appreciate at the time. He went a little too far with it, obviously. But he enjoyed children, and they loved him.
But he admitted to using the screams of a child as a sex toy.
Yep, yes, he did. He would use those, he said he enjoyed listening to the screams of a child being beaten.
He told me once that he had been a victim of cryptorchidism in his adolescence, up until his adolescence, and it hadn't been diagnosed or treated until then. The testes are undescended, and what that does, of course, is it would postpone the development of male secondary sex characteristics until the testes are surgically brought down into the scrotum. And I think that probably was also a basis for his feeling of otherness into his early teenage years. Lee liked the attention he got from springboard diving. Then, of course, as he got older, that was no longer, you know, a possibility. And that might have disappointed him a bit, yeah. And then, of course, when he could no longer teach, that, you know, knocked another leg off the stool.
His favorite thing was, he liked to talk about, was rat fucking people, or which we called RF. And he had a real strong hatred of authority.
He'd get even if he thought he'd been slighted or, you know, something wrong. He was a very vindictive person.
Toschi told me these stories about Arthur Lee Allen, and as you know, the way that came about, I was visiting Toschi, and I said, I'd read this book on criminology, and they said, you know what, the guy who really did it will often try to help the police. And I said, you know, Dave, you've got 2,500 suspects. Did one of them ever try to help you, write you a letter? And Toschi says, yeah, I just got it, and it's from prison, and it's from Arthur Lee Allen. He says, I'm sorry I wasn't your man, I wish I could help. And I go, wow, that's certainly promising. Well, Eventually, Toschi starts talking about this trip to the oil refinery where he'd met Alan. And this had all been initiated by a man named Don Cheney, who was one of Alan's roommates, who was an engineer who'd been in the area and left just before the series of murders had started.
Well, it was on that New Year's Day, 1969, when we had this conversation, and I never saw him again after that. The first thing we talked about, when I arrived there, he showed me the watch. You know, he'd received it Christmas, and it was in the box with the card, and everything was there. And he asked me what I thought of it. Was it a good watch? He had the attitude that maybe his mother had stiffed him and given him a cheap watch. But the watch was a Zodiac watch, and it had that little symbol on the face. He'd been fired from Valley Springs, and I know that he really sent a lot of resumes to get that job, and he liked it over there. And he got fired, and it looked like he wasn't going to teach anymore. And I was concerned about what he was going to do, and I, went over there to kind of pep him up and talk to him about career choices and that sort of thing, and started asking him what he was going to do. And through